Expired. Seriously, mister, this thing's practically falling apart. Melissa Jenkins snickered, holding the worn military identification card between her manicured nails as if it might contaminate her. She shot a mocking glance at her coworker, Tina, behind the customer service counter. The middle-aged man standing before them, James Harrison, 62, remained composed, his weathered face revealing no reaction to her condescension. Only the slight tightening around his eyes betrayed his discomfort. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It's still valid for identification purposes, James said, quietly, his voice carrying the gentle rasp of someone who'd once been accustomed to command. I just need to complete this transaction. Melissa laughed outright this time. Yeah, sure it is. Bet this expired before I was even born. She held the card up to the fluorescent light dramatically, making a show of inspecting it for her. Amused colleague. James simply looked past her, his gaze steady, and calmly stated, "Perhaps I should speak with the manager." That stopped the laughter. The store suddenly seemed unnaturally quiet. If you believe respect should be given regardless of appearances, type honor below. James Harrison lived a life deliberately removed from attention. His modest two-bedroom house on Cedar Street was well-maintained but unremarkable. The lawn neatly trimmed, the American flag by the door, the only personal touch visible from the street. Neighbors knew him as the friendly but private man who always waved but rarely engaged in lengthy conversations. He dressed simply, khaki pants, button-down shirts, sometimes a windbreaker when the weather turned. Nothing about his appearance suggested the 30 years he'd spent serving his country in some of the most dangerous regions of the world. James was a ghost in his own community, a retired Marine Corps colonel whose classified operations in counterterrorism and intelligence had shaped American foreign policy for decades. He'd advised generals, trained elite units, and led missions that remained sealed in classified files. Yet here in Riverdale, he was just Mr. Harrison, the quiet widower who volunteered at the Veterans Center twice a week. After his wife, Elizabeth, passed away from cancer 3 years ago, James had retreated further into himself. He'd let certain things slide, including updating his military identification card. He rarely needed it anymore, preferring the simplicity of his driver's license. For most transactions, his retirement checks were direct deposited, and he lived frugally on his pension and savings. Today, however, was different. James needed to complete a significant wire transfer to help his daughter with the down payment on her first home, a surprise gift he'd been saving for over 5 years. The amount required additional identification verification according to the bank's policies for fraud prevention. He knew his military ID was expired, but assumed it would still serve as a secondary form of identification alongside his valid driver's license, especially for a simple verification procedure at a bank where he'd been a customer for 15 years. He hadn't counted on encountering Melissa Jenkins. The Riverdale First National Bank prided itself on its modern glass and steel downtown branch, the epitome of professionalism and security. The customer service desk was staffed by 2 representatives that Tuesday morning. Tina Rodriguez, newer and seemingly more professional, handled most initial inquiries with efficiency. Melissa Jenkins, with her 5 years of seniority, often took charge of more complex transactions, wearing her authority with visible self-importance. James had approached the counter calmly, presented his driver's license and expired military ID, and explained his purpose. Tina had begun the process professionally, typing his information into the system. When she noticed the expired military ID, she frowned slightly. "Sir, I see this military identification is expired. Do you have another form of—" Before she could finish, Melissa had leaned over, plucking the ID from Tina's hand. "Expired?" she echoed loudly, ensuring other customers could hear. Seriously, mister? This thing's practically falling apart. That's when she'd started laughing, holding the card up mockingly. James tried to explain, maintaining his composure despite the public humiliation. It's still a valid form of identification for verifying identity, even if the privileges tied to it have lapsed. I just need it as a secondary verification for the wire transfer. My primary ID is current. Melissa cut him off with a dismissive wave. Rules are rules. Bank policy requires 2 current forms of identification for transactions over $10,000. An expired ID isn't valid, no matter who you used to be. She tapped the faded photo. Don't even look much like this guy anymore. The physical identifiers. Match, James stated calmly, refusing to be provoked. The bank manager has made exceptions before when the primary ID is valid. Perhaps we could... We're not making exceptions just because you couldn't be bothered to renew your card, Melissa interrupted, her voice dripping with condescension. You military types always think the rules don't apply to you. Access denied. She held the ID out dismissively. James didn't take it back immediately. He looked at Melissa, then at Tina, who shifted uncomfortably but remained silent under her colleague's dominant presence. James knew arguing further about the ID itself was pointless with this particular person. He needed to find another solution. I understand, James said, his tone measured. Before I leave, I'd like to speak with the branch manager. I believe Mr. Davidson would be willing to verify my identity personally. We've known each other for some time. Melissa stared at James as if he'd said something ridiculous, then laughed again. Mr. Davidson, you know the branch manager personally? Sure you do? She rolled her eyes dramatically. Let me guess, you played golf together last weekend. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I've been a customer here for 15 years, James replied evenly. Mr. Davidson has handled my account since he started as a loan officer. Tina looked increasingly uncomfortable. She recognized James as a regular customer, even if Melissa didn't. Melissa, maybe we should... Maybe nothing, Melissa snapped, silencing her colleague. She turned back to James, her face flushed with the peculiar anger of someone drunk on minor power. You think you can just walk in here with an expired ID, name-drop the manager and get special treatment? That's not how banking regulations work. Now either provide a second valid ID or I'll have to ask you to leave. James held Melissa's gaze, his voice dropping slightly, but gaining an edge of quiet authority that momentarily pierced her armor of arrogance. Ms. Jenkins, I understand you're following procedure as you interpret it. However, Regulation B of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act allows for reasonable accommodation when a customer's identity can be verified through alternative means. Mr. Davidson is familiar with my financial history and can personally verify my identity. The reference to banking regulations hung in the air. Melissa had no idea what James was talking about, but Tina visibly tensed. Even with limited experience, she recognized that this customer knew banking policies better than Melissa did. Tina subtly tried to get Melissa's attention, shaking her head slightly as if to warn her. But Melissa, blinded by her own perceived authority, ignored her. Regulation B, Melissa mocked. Right, you've been watching too many banking documentaries, Grandpa. She gestured contemptuously toward the waiting area. Fine, if you want to waste more of your retirement waiting for Mr. Davidson, be my guest. He's in a meeting and won't be available for at least an hour, but don't expect any special treatment. She turned away, already dismissing James as a harmless, perhaps slightly delusional old man who would eventually give up and leave. James nodded curtly and walked to the waiting area, settling into one of the leather chairs with the patients. of a man who had waited in far worse conditions for far more important outcomes. Tina watched him go, chewing her lip nervously. She'd only been at the branch for 3 months, but even she knew that James Harrison was a valued customer. She'd seen his name on several high-value accounts during her training. More importantly, she'd noticed how respectfully the other senior staff treated him when he came in. Something wasn't right about how this was being handled. 20 minutes passed. The bank continued its normal operations, customers coming and going. James sat quietly, reviewing documents on his phone, occasionally glancing toward the glass-walled office where branch manager Robert Davidson was indeed in a meeting. Melissa had returned to her regular duties, occasionally shooting smug glances in James's direction, clearly expecting him to give up and leave. Then the glass door to the manager's office opened. Robert Davidson, a trim man in his early 50s, wearing an impeccably tailored navy suit, emerged with 2 other men in business attire. They shook hands, exchanged pleasant goodbyes, and the visitors headed for the exit. Davidson turned, scanning the lobby, and immediately noticed James. His professional smile transformed into something warmer, more genuine. "Colonel Harrison," Davidson called out, striding across the lobby. "I didn't know you were coming in today. Is everything all right?" The title, Colonel, echoed across the marble floor of the bank lobby. Several customers looked up. Melissa froze at her station, her fingers hovering above her keyboard. James stood, accepting Davidson's extended hand with a firm handshake. "Robert, good to see you. I was hoping to complete a wire transfer today, but I've run into a small issue with my identification." Davidson frowned slightly. "That shouldn't be a problem. You've been with us for, 15 years now? Let me take care of this personally." He gestured toward his office. "Please, come with me." As they walked, Davidson noticed James's slight limp, more pronounced than the last time they'd met. "How's the knee doing? Still giving you trouble from that jump in Kosovo?" "Some days are better than others," James replied with a small smile. "Elizabeth always said I should have let them replace it years ago." "She was a wise woman," Davidson said, his voice softening at the mention of James's late wife. "We all miss her at the charity galas. No one could organize a silent auction like Elizabeth." As they passed the customer service desk, Davidson paused, noticing Melissa's wide-eyed stare and Tina's nervous expression. Was Colonel Harrison being helped here? Before either woman could respond, a new voice entered the conversation. "Yes, he was, and I'd very much like to know why a decorated Marine Corps veteran was kept waiting." The voice came from behind them, carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to command. Everyone turned to see a tall man in his early 60s, standing just inside the entrance, wearing the distinctive dress blues of a Marine Corps brigadier general. 4 rows of service ribbons adorned his chest, including the silver star and purple heart. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Even customers with no military background could sense the authority he carried. Davidson blinked in surprise. "General Walsh, I didn't expect to see you today." "I was meeting James for lunch after his errand here," General Michael Walsh replied, walking forward with measured steps. His eyes moved from Davidson to Melissa, who had gone pale. "When he didn't show up at the restaurant, I decided to check if he was still here." He turned to James. "Everything all right, old friend?" James nodded slightly. "Just a small misunderstanding about my expired military ID, Mike. Nothing serious." General Walsh's expression suggested he thought otherwise. "Your expired ID? The one that identifies you as Colonel James Harrison, Silver Star recipient, 30-year Marine Corps veteran, and former commander of Special Operations Task Force Sierra." The silence in the bank was absolute. Melissa looked like she might faint. Tina stared at James with new eyes, suddenly seeing not the quiet older customer, but a decorated military commander. General Walsh turned to Davidson. "Robert, I assume whatever issue existed has been resolved." Davidson straightened instinctively, almost at attention. "Absolutely, General. I'll personally handle Colonel Harrison's transaction immediately." He shot a glance at Melissa that promised a serious conversation later. "Miss Jenkins, please pull up Colonel Harrison's accounts and prepare the wire transfer forms." Melissa fumbled with her keyboard, her hands trembling. Yes, sir. Right away." As they walked toward Davidson's office, General Walsh placed a hand on James's shoulder. "You know, James, this reminds me of that time in Fallujah when that young lieutenant questioned your orders until the battalion commander walked in." James allowed himself a small smile. "The difference is that lieutenant learned his lesson. Some people need more direct education about respect." The aftermath was swift and decisive. With both Davidson and General Walsh present, James's wire transfer was processed immediately, with profuse apologies for the delay and inconvenience. Melissa was asked to wait in the break room until Davidson could speak with her. Once James's business was concluded, Davidson escorted him and General Walsh to the door, apologizing again for the treatment James had received. "This is completely unacceptable, Colonel Harrison. I assure you it won't happen again." "We all make mistakes, Robert," James replied graciously. "The important thing is how we respond to them." After they left, Davidson returned to find Tina, waiting nervously by his office. "Sir," she began hesitantly, "I just wanted to say I should have done more to help Colonel Harrison. I knew something wasn't right with how Melissa was handling things." Davidson's expression softened slightly. "Yes, you should have, but at least you recognize it. That's a start." He gestured to his office. "Come in for a moment. I think you should hear what I have to say to Ms. Jenkins. It'll be educational." Melissa Jenkins sat rigidly in the leather chair across from Robert Davidson's desk. Her usual confidence evaporated like morning mist under a harsh sun. Tina Rodriguez stood quietly by the door, instructed to observe and learn from whatever was about to unfold. The tension in the office was palpable, broken only by the gentle ticking of the antique clock on the wall, a retirement gift to Davidson from the bank's board of directors. Davidson leaned forward, his fingers steepled, eyes focused intently on Melissa. "Do you know who Colonel James Harrison is, Ms. Jenkins?" Melissa swallowed hard. I know now he's a retired Marine Corps colonel, sir." "He's considerably more than that," Davidson said, his voice measured but carrying an edge of steel rarely heard by his employees. He turned his computer monitor so Melissa could see the screen. On it was James Harrison's customer profile, showing account balances that made her eyes widen. "Colonel Harrison has been a premium client of this bank for 15 years. His combined assets under our management exceed 7 figures. But that's not why what happened today was unacceptable." Davidson clicked to another screen. "This is a partial biography of Colonel Harrison that General Walsh sent me while you were waiting." Melissa leaned forward, reading snippets of an extraordinary career. James Harrison had enlisted in the Marines at 18, earned his commission through exceptional service, risen through the ranks during conflicts from Vietnam to the Gulf War to Afghanistan, specialized in intelligence and counterterrorism, awarded the Silver Star for valor during a classified operation, commanded elite units whose very existence remained officially unacknowledged, served as military liaison to the CIA, NSA, and State Department on critical missions. After retirement, he'd consulted for the Department of Defense on special projects. Colonel Harrison was responsible for operations that saved hundreds, possibly thousands of American lives, Davidson continued. He sacrificed his knee during a parachute jump into hostile territory to extract intelligence assets. He's missed anniversaries, birthdays, and his daughter's graduation because he was serving this country in places so dangerous they don't appear on maps. Melissa felt the blood drain from her face. I didn't know. Of course you didn't know, Davidson interrupted, his voice sharp. That's precisely the point. You couldn't possibly have known his background just by looking at him, and yet you treated him with contempt based on nothing but an expired identification card and your own assumptions about who he was. Davidson stood, pacing behind his desk. This isn't just about Colonel Harrison, though. This is about how you approach your job fundamentally. I've received 3 customer complaints about your attitude in the past month alone. I've observed you dismissing elderly clients, talking down to people you perceive as unsophisticated, and playing favorites with customers you think are important. Tina shifted uncomfortably by the door, surprised by the revelation. She'd witnessed Melissa's behavior, but hadn't realized it was a pattern that management had already noticed. Banking is built on trust and respect, Miss Jenkins, Davidson continued. Every person who walks through that door deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance, the balance in their accounts, or the status of their identification. Some of our most valuable clients are the most unassuming people you'll ever meet. Melissa's eyes dropped to her hands, which were twisting nervously in her lap. I understand, sir. It won't happen again. Davidson's expression remained stern. You're right about that. I've spoken with HR. Effective immediately, you're being placed on unpaid administrative leave for 2 weeks. Upon your return, you'll be reassigned to our operations department, away from direct customer contact. You'll also complete our full customer service training program again before being considered for any client-facing position. Melissa's head snapped up, shock evident on her face. But sir, I've been in customer service for 5 years. My performance metrics. Your metrics on paper are satisfactory, but they don't measure how you make people feel, Davidson interrupted. Banking isn't just about processing transactions. It's about building relationships. Colonel Harrison isn't the first person you've humiliated, but he will be the last. At least at this branch. Davidson returned to his seat, his expression softening slightly. This isn't just punitive, Melissa. This is an opportunity for you to reassess your approach. Your technical skills are solid. Your attention to detail is excellent. But your people skills need significant improvement if you want a future in this industry. He turned to Tina, who straightened instinctively under his gaze. Ms. Rodriguez, what would you have done differently in this situation? Tina hesitated, glancing nervously at Melissa before responding. I should have spoken up more clearly when I recognized Colonel Harrison as a regular customer. I should have suggested we check his profile in the system, which would have shown his status. And I should have offered to get you immediately when Ms. Jenkins dismissed his request to speak with you. Davidson nodded, approvingly. Exactly. You recognized there was a problem, but you didn't take decisive action. In banking, that can cost relationships we've spent years building. He gestured to the chair beside Melissa. Sit down, please. I want both of you to understand something important. Tina quickly took the offered seat, her back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. Davidson leaned back, his expression thoughtful. When I started in this industry 30 years ago, my first manager told me something I've never forgotten. He said, the person in worn work boots might have more in their account than the one in Italian leather shoes. I've found that to be true more often than not. He pulled a photograph from his desk drawer and placed it on the desk where both women could see it. It showed a much younger Robert Davidson in army dress uniform, standing beside several other soldiers. Before I was a banker, I was a financial services officer in the army. I worked with people like Colonel Harrison. I saw firsthand how they lived, modestly, quietly, without drawing attention to their service or sacrifices. His Voice took on a reverent quality. The most decorated soldier in my unit drove a 15-year-old pickup truck and lived in a small apartment. He had millions in investments, but wore the same 3 faded polo shirts every week. You would never have known who he was just by looking at him. Melissa stared at the photograph, seeing her boss in a new light. "I didn't know you served, Mr. Davidson." "Most people don't. I don't wear it on my sleeve," he replied, "just like Colonel Harrison doesn't advertise who he is or what he's done. True service isn't about recognition. It's about doing what's right, regardless of who's watching." Davidson put the photograph away and folded his hands on the desk. "Here's what I want both of you to understand. In this job, we interact with people during some of the most important moments of their lives: buying homes, sending children to college, planning for retirement, starting businesses, making gifts that will change family trajectories, like Colonel Harrison was trying to do for his daughter today." He paused, letting his words sink in. "These aren't just transactions, they're dreams, aspirations, legacies, and every single person who walks through those doors deserves to have their dreams treated with respect, regardless of whether their ID is current or their clothes are fashionable or their account balance is impressive." Tina nodded earnestly, while Melissa stared at the floor, her cheeks flushed with shame. "Ms. Rodriguez," Davidson continued, "starting tomorrow, you'll be assigned to work with Ms. Winters, our senior client relationship specialist. She exemplifies the approach I'm describing. Learn from her. Observe how she treats every client, as if they're the most important person in the bank, because to her, at that moment, they are." Tina straightened, recognizing the opportunity being presented. "Thank you, sir. I won't disappoint you." Davidson turned back to Melissa. "Ms. Jenkins, I want you to use these 2 weeks to reflect on whether this is the right career path for you. Banking requires empathy and humility, alongside technical skills and attention to detail. If you decide to return, you'll need to demonstrate all 4 qualities consistently." Melissa nodded silently, her usual bravado completely deflated. "That will be all for now," Davidson concluded. "Ms. Jenkins, please collect your personal items and check in with HR before leaving. Ms. Rodriguez, you may return to your station." As the women stood to leave, Davidson added one final thought. "Remember this: the measure of your success in banking isn't the size of the transactions you process or the speed at which you complete them. It's the trust you build and the respect you show, every time." After they left his office, Davidson sat quietly for a moment, then picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. "Colonel Harrison, Robert Davidson, I wanted to personally apologize again for your experience today." He listened for a moment, then smiled. "Yes, it's been addressed. Actually, that's partly why I'm calling. I have a favor to ask." The young woman who observed the situation, Ms. Rodriguez, shows real promise. Would you be willing to come in next week to share some of your leadership insights with our junior staff? I think it would be invaluable." Another pause. "Excellent, and please give my regards to General Walsh. Tell him his timing was impeccable, as always." Davidson hung up, satisfied that something positive might emerge from the day's unfortunate events. He made a note to order a new name plaque for Tina's desk, one that reflected the promotion she would receive after her training with Ms. Winters. Sometimes, he mused, the most important leadership lessons came from witnessing both negative and positive examples in rapid succession. Meanwhile, across town, James Harrison pulled into the driveway of his modest home. The American flag fluttered gently in the afternoon breeze. He sat in his car for a moment, reflecting on the day's events. Then he reached for his phone and dialed his daughter's number. "Sarah, it's Dad. Good news. The money will be in your account tomorrow morning. He smiled at her excited response. No, no problems at all. Just a slight delay. He didn't mention the confrontation or humiliation. Some battles weren't worth recounting, especially when they ended well. How about you and Mark come over for dinner this weekend? We can toast to your new home. Another pause. Love you too, sweetheart. See you Saturday. James stepped out of his car, wincing slightly as his bad knee protested. The events at the bank had stirred up old memories, some pleasant, some painful, 30 years of service compressed into a few moments of recognition. It was strange how life worked sometimes. As he approached his front door, his neighbor Frank called out from across the street. Afternoon, Jim. Say, was that you I saw downtown earlier? Thought I spotted you going into the bank in your usual get-up. Frank gestured to James's simple khakis and button-down shirt. James smiled. Just doing some banking, Frank. Nothing exciting. Frank chuckled. With you, Jim, I'm never quite sure. My wife still talks about that time the Secretary of Defense showed up at our block party looking for you, nearly dropped her potato salad. Richard was just in town for a fishing trip, James replied modestly. Old friends, that's all. Old friends, Frank echoed, shaking his head with a knowing smile. One of these days, Jim, you're going to have to tell me what you really did before you moved to our little corner of nowhere. James's smile remained pleasant, but revealed nothing. Maybe one of these days. He waved goodbye and continued to his door. Inside, James hung his light jacket in the closet and moved to his study, the one room in the house that hinted at his past life. On the walls hung carefully framed photographs, James in various deployed locations, standing with fellow Marines whose faces would never be recognizable to the general public, but who had changed the course of history through their quiet service. A shadow box contained his silver star and other decorations. On the bookshelf sat volumes on military strategy, intelligence operations, and international relations, many written by people he'd trained or mentored. He eased himself into the leather chair behind his desk, a retirement gift from his unit, and opened his laptop to check if the wire transfer to his daughter's account had been initiated as promised. It had. A soft chime indicated an incoming email. It was from General Walsh. Lunch tomorrow instead? 1300 at the usual place. Bringing someone you should meet. Young Marine captain, shows promise. Reminds me of you 30 years ago. Could use some mentoring from someone who's been there. James smiled and typed a quick reply. I'll be there. Rare or well done. The response came almost immediately. Still rare. Some things never change. James closed his laptop and leaned back, reflecting on the day's events. The incident at the bank had been unpleasant, but it had also reinforced something he'd always believed. True respect wasn't about appearances or titles. It was about character, about how you treated people when nothing was required of you. He thought about Melissa Jenkins, the young woman who had mocked his expired ID. He felt no anger toward her, only a vague hope that today's lesson would help her grow. Some of the best officers he'd commanded had started as arrogant young recruits who needed their perspectives adjusted. Sometimes humility was the most valuable gift you could give someone. He thought about Tina Rodriguez, who had recognized something was wrong, but lacked the confidence to speak up. He'd seen that too. Good people who needed encouragement to find their voice. Maybe Davidson's mentorship would help her develop that confidence. And he thought about Robert Davidson, who understood the value of respect regardless of rank or status. The banking industry needed more leaders like him, people who recognized that every interaction was an opportunity to demonstrate character. James's gaze fell on a framed quote on his wall, words that had guided him throughout his career and into retirement. The true measure of a person is how they treat someone who can do nothing for them. Tomorrow he would meet the young Captain General Walsh was bringing. He would listen more than he spoke, ask questions that made the young officer think, and share just enough of his experience to be helpful without overwhelming. It was what his own mentors had done for him decades ago, passing the torch of wisdom earned through sacrifice and service. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by mementos of a life spent in the shadows of history, James Harrison felt content. His military ID might be expired, but his ability to make a difference never would. Some forms of service had no expiration date. The following morning dawned clear and bright in Riverdale, the kind of autumn day that painted the world in shades of amber and gold. In her small apartment across town, Tina Rodriguez prepared for work with unusual care. She chose her most professional outfit, a charcoal pencil skirt and burgundy blouse, and spent extra time ensuring her appearance was impeccable. Today wasn't just another day at the bank. It was her first day working with Catherine Winters, the senior client relationship specialist whom Mr. Davidson had described as exemplary. As Tina pinned her name badge to her blouse, she thought about yesterday's events. The image of Colonel Harrison standing quietly dignified while Melissa mocked his expired ID still made her stomach twist with discomfort. Worse was the memory of her own silence, her failure to intervene when she knew something was wrong. She'd been at the bank only 3 months, but that was no excuse. Character wasn't measured in months of employment. Never again, she promised her reflection in the mirror. Today marked a new chapter in her professional life. Today, she would find her voice. Across town, in a significantly larger apartment, filled with designer furniture and the latest electronics, Melissa Jenkins lay awake, staring at her ceiling. Sleep had eluded her most of the night, her mind replaying the humiliating scene in Davidson's office, the revelation of who James Harrison really was, the suspension that would leave a permanent mark on her employment record. 5 years of climbing the ladder at Riverdale First National, carefully cultivating an image of efficiency and authority, undermined in a single morning by her own arrogance. The loss of income from 2 weeks' unpaid leave was substantial, but the blow to her professional reputation felt catastrophic. "How was I supposed to know?" she whispered to the empty room, the same question she'd been asking herself since yesterday. But even as the words left her lips, she recognized their hollowness. The truth was painfully simple. She hadn't needed to know who James Harrison was to treat him with basic respect. The realization sat heavy in her chest. For the first time, Melissa faced the uncomfortable possibility that her approach to customer service, to people in general, had been fundamentally flawed all along. At 8:45 a.m., Tina entered the bank, 15 minutes earlier than required. The lobby was quiet, with only a few early customers waiting for the doors to officially open at 9 now. She spotted Catherine Winters immediately, a woman in her mid-50s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled into an elegant chignon. Arranging documents at her desk with practiced precision, Tina approached nervously. "Ms. Winters, I'm Tina Rodriguez. Mr. Davidson assigned me to work with you starting today." Catherine looked up, her intelligent eyes quickly assessing Tina. Then she smiled, the expression transforming her serious face into something warm and welcoming. "Of course, Tina. Robert mentioned you'd be joining me." She gestured to the newly arranged desk adjacent to hers. "That will be your station. I took the liberty of gathering some materials I thought might be helpful for you." Tina noticed a neatly organized folder labeled Client Relationship Essentials, alongside several banking manuals she hadn't seen during her initial training. "Thank you. I'm really looking forward to learning from you." Catherine's smile deepened. "Robert told me about yesterday's incident with Colonel Harrison." Her voice dropped slightly. "I've known the Colonel for nearly a decade. He's one of our most valued clients, not because of his account balance, but because of his character." Tina nodded, ashamed again at her silence during the confrontation. "I should have done more." "Yes," Catherine agreed, her tone gentle but unflinching. "You should have. But recognizing that is the first step toward doing better next time. She checked her elegant wristwatch. We have 15 minutes before we open. Let me share something with you. She opened her desk drawer and removed a small, leather-bound notebook. When I started in banking 30 years ago, my mentor gave me this advice. Every person who walks through that door is carrying an invisible backpack. You can't see what's inside. Their worries, their dreams, their struggles, their triumphs, but you can choose to treat them as if that backpack contains something precious and fragile. I've never forgotten that. Catherine opened the notebook, revealing pages filled with neat handwriting. I keep notes on our regular clients, not just their financial information, but personal details they share. Mr. Peterson's granddaughter just started college. Mrs. Abernathy's garden won first prize at the county fair. The Thompsons are expecting their first child in December. She looked up at Tina. Banking is about money, yes, but more fundamentally, it's about people's lives, their hopes, their futures, their legacies. Tina's eyes widened as she understood. You remember all these details about your clients? I make it my business to, Catherine confirmed, not because it's required, but because it matters. When Mr. Peterson comes in and I ask how Emma is enjoying Northwestern, he knows I see him as a person, not just an account number. That builds the kind of trust that transcends transactions. Tina thought about Colonel Harrison, about how differently yesterday might have unfolded if Melissa had approached him with this mindset. I want to learn to do that. Catherine's expression turned serious. It requires genuine interest in people. Tina, you can't fake that. If you're only remembering details to make the sale or get the promotion, clients will sense it. She closed her notebook. The question is, do you genuinely care about the people who will sit across from you today? The question hung in the air between them, unexpectedly profound, for a Tuesday morning in a community bank. Tina considered it honestly. I think I do. I want to. That's a good start, Catherine nodded approvingly. Caring can be developed. Like any skill, it begins with attention. She stood as the clock approached 9. Ready to open? Tina nodded, feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. Ready. As the day progressed, Tina observed Catherine in action, with a range of clients, from college students opening their first accounts to retirees managing their nest eggs. With each interaction, Catherine demonstrated the approach she'd described. Attentive, personalized, respectful, regardless of the client's age or apparent financial status. Most striking to Tina was how Catherine handled a particularly difficult client, an elderly woman named Mrs. Finch, who came in confused and agitated about transactions she didn't recognize on her statement. Rather than becoming impatient or dismissive, Catherine took her to a private office, offered her tea, and spent 45 minutes carefully reviewing each transaction, explaining banking terms in simple language and reassuring her that her money was safe. When they emerged, Mrs. Finch was smiling, patting Catherine's hand affectionately. You're an angel, Katie, an absolute angel. After Mrs. Finch left, Tina couldn't help asking, doesn't that take up a lot of time? 45 minutes for one client. Catherine arranged some papers on her desk before responding. Mrs. Finch has been banking here for 53 years. Her late husband was one of the founding investors in Riverdale Manufacturing, which employed half this town for decades. More importantly, she's an 87-year-old widow living alone, and banking is already intimidating enough for her generation without adding confusion about digital transactions. She looked up at Tina. Time is our most valuable commodity. Yes, but how we allocate it speaks volumes about our priorities. Sometimes efficiency matters most. Other times, humanity does. Just before their lunch break, Robert Davidson approached their desk area. Ms. Winters, Ms. Rodriguez, I wanted to let you know that Colonel Harrison has graciously agreed to speak to our junior staff next Tuesday about leadership principles. I'd like both of you to attend." Tina's surprise must have shown on her face, because Davidson added, "The Colonel holds no ill will about yesterday's incident, Ms. Rodriguez. In fact, he specifically mentioned that he appreciated your professional demeanor." After Davidson left, Tina turned to Catherine, bewildered. Why would Colonel Harrison agree to help the bank after how he was treated? Catherine smiled knowingly. That's who he is. Men like James Harrison understand that leadership isn't about wielding power or holding grudges. It's about using your experience to elevate others. She began gathering her things for lunch. You can learn a great deal from him if you listen carefully. Meanwhile, across town at Harbourside Grill, James Harrison sat at a corner table overlooking the river. The restaurant was moderately upscale but not ostentatious. White tablecloths and polished glassware alongside simple, hearty fare. It was the kind of place where conversations could remain private despite the open floor plan, a quality James had always appreciated. At precisely 1 p.m., General Michael Walsh entered, still cutting an impressive figure in his civilian clothes, a tailored charcoal suit that hinted at his military bearing without announcing it. Behind him walked a younger man, perhaps 30, with the unmistakable posture and haircut of an active-duty Marine officer, though he too wore civilian attire. James stood to greet them, exchanging a firm handshake with Mike and a warm smile. "Right on time, as always." "Some habits die hard," Mike replied with a chuckle. He turned to the younger man. "James, this is Captain Daniel Reyes." "Daniel, Colonel James Harrison." Captain Reyes straightened almost imperceptibly, his handshake respectful but confident. "It's an honor, sir. General Walsh has told me a great deal about your work." James gestured for them to sit. "Nothing classified, I hope." "Just the unclassified highlights," Mike assured him with a wink. "Enough for Daniel to understand why I thought you two should meet." A waiter appeared with water and menus. Once they'd ordered, James and Mike both choosing the restaurant's famous ribeye rare, Daniel opting for salmon, the conversation turned to more substantive matters. "Daniel's just returned from his second tour in the Middle East," Mike explained. "Intelligence operations primarily. He's demonstrated exceptional aptitude for the kind of work you used to specialize in, James." James studied the young captain thoughtfully. "And how are you finding it, Captain? The intelligence field can be morally complex." Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. "Challenging, sir, both intellectually and ethically. There are rarely clear-cut answers, and the stakes are incredibly high." "That's precisely what I told James when we first met," Mike interjected. "Remember that joint operation in '89, James? You were evaluating me for that special task force." James nodded, memories flooding back. "You were a brash young captain then, convinced you had all the answers." "Not unlike someone else at this table," Mike replied, glancing meaningfully at Daniel, who had the good grace to look slightly abashed. "I wouldn't say I have all the answers, sir," Daniel clarified. "But I do have strong convictions about how intelligence work should be conducted." "Let me guess," James said, leaning forward slightly. "You believe in absolute transparency within the chain of command. You think intelligence should be gathered as ethically as possible, even when it means accepting greater risk. You're uncomfortable with the occasional moral compromises that come with the territory, but you recognize their necessity in certain circumstances." Daniel's eyes widened slightly. "That's remarkably accurate, sir." James exchanged a knowing look with Mike. "Because I was you 30 years ago, so was General Walsh. We all start idealistic. The question is how to maintain that core idealism while developing the pragmatism necessary for effective operations. Might Their food arrived, temporarily pausing the conversation. As they began eating, James continued, his tone conversational but carrying the weight of experience. "The hardest lesson I learned in intelligence work wasn't about the enemy, Captain. It was about myself, about recognizing that principles without flexibility become dogma, and flexibility without principles becomes moral drift." Daniel nodded, absorbing the words. "How did you navigate that balance, sir?" James cut a piece of his steak before answering. "I developed a personal code that wasn't tied to specific scenarios, but to fundamental values. Protection of innocent life, truth to power, even when unwelcome, respect for human dignity, even the enemy's." He looked up at Daniel. "But I also accepted that perfect solutions rarely exist in our line of work. Sometimes all options involve compromise." Mike added his perspective. James was notorious for creative problem-solving that maintained the mission objective while minimizing ethical compromises. It's one reason his operations had among the highest success rates and lowest civilian casualty counts in the division. Daniel looked genuinely interested now, professional curiosity overcoming his initial reserve. "Would you be willing to share an example, sir? Obviously nothing classified, but perhaps something instructive?" James considered for a moment, then nodded. 1992, Eastern Europe. Post-Soviet chaos. We needed information from a particular official who was selling weapons to terrorist groups. Traditional approach would have been to leverage his vulnerabilities, perhaps his gambling debts or his extramarital affairs. Standard pressure points, Daniel acknowledged. Exactly, but leveraging either would have potentially exposed innocent parties to harm, his family specifically. Instead, we identified his primary motivation, fear of irrelevance in the new political order. James took a sip of water. We orchestrated a scenario where he could appear valuable to his superiors by discovering weapons smuggling operations, the very ones he was involved in. He provided us with the intelligence we needed, thinking he was building his reputation while actually dismantling his own operation. Daniel's brow furrowed. "So you manipulated him, but without threatening or harming him or his family." "The operation met our intelligence requirements and disrupted the weapons flow without creating additional victims," James confirmed. "Was it morally pristine? No, but it was more ethical than the alternatives." Mike smiled at the memory. That operation became a case study at the War College, though few knew James was behind it. As they continued their meal, the conversation shifted to Daniel's current assignment, a training position at Quantico that would shape the next generation of intelligence officers. James offered insights on teaching methodologies, on identifying potential in recruits, on balancing technical skills with ethical judgment. By the time dessert arrived, apple pie for James, chocolate cake for Mike, coffee only for Daniel. The initial formality had given way to a comfortable professional rapport. James found himself impressed by the young captain's sharp mind and thoughtful questions. He saw echoes of his younger self, yes, but also unique strengths that would serve Daniel well in his career. As they prepared to leave, Daniel asked a final question. "Sir, looking back on your career, what would you say was your greatest accomplishment? What are you most proud of?" James considered the question carefully. So many operations, so many moments of crisis averted, lives saved, threats neutralized. But his answer surprised even Mike. "In 30 years of service, I never lost sight of why I was doing the work," James said quietly. "Not for advancement, not for recognition, but because it needed doing, and I could do it well. I'm proud that I remained the same person in the field that I was at home, that I didn't become someone my wife and daughter couldn't recognize." Daniel nodded slowly, seeming to understand the profound nature of this accomplishment in a profession that often changed people, sometimes irrevocably. Outside the restaurant, as they prepared to part ways, James extended his hand to Daniel. "If you ever need perspective on a difficult situation, Captain, don't hesitate to call. Mike has my number." "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that more than I can express." Daniel's handshake was firm, his gratitude evident. After Daniel had walked to his car, Mike turned to James with a knowing smile. "He reminds you of yourself, doesn't he?" "Perhaps," James acknowledged, "but with better prospects, I think. The Corps has evolved since our day." Mike laughed. "Some things never change, though. Speaking of which, that business at the bank yesterday. Classic Harrison, making your point without saying a word." James shook his head ruefully. "I didn't plan for you to show up, Mike. I was perfectly capable of handling the situation." "Of course you were. But why should you have to?" Mike's expression turned serious. "You've spent your life handling situations, James. Sometimes it's okay to let your friends step in." As they said their goodbyes, James reflected on Mike's words. Throughout his career, he'd been the one others relied on, the steady hand, the clear thinker, the moral compass. He'd rarely asked for help, seeing self-sufficiency as strength. Perhaps that was the next lesson he needed to learn in retirement, that accepting support wasn't weakness, but another form of connection. Driving home, James found himself thinking about the upcoming presentation at the bank. What could he offer those young employees that would be truly valuable? Technical advice about financial services wasn't his expertise, but leadership principles, those transcended specific industries. He would speak about recognizing worth beyond appearances, about the quiet dignity of service without recognition, about treating each person as if they mattered because they did, about finding purpose larger than oneself. As he pulled into his driveway, James noticed something unusual, a sleek BMW parked on the street in front of his house. His daughter Sarah stood on his porch, smiling broadly as he approached. "I thought we were meeting Saturday," he said, embracing her. "We are," Sarah replied, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "But I couldn't wait to show you something." She handed him a small gift bag. Inside, James found a wooden picture frame. The photo showed a modest but charming two-story house with a sold sign in the front yard. Written across the bottom, in Sarah's elegant handwriting, "Our first home, made possible by Dad." James felt his throat tighten with emotion. "It's perfect, sweetheart." Sarah linked her arm through his as they walked inside. "The down payment cleared this morning." "We close in 3 weeks." She squeezed his arm gently. "Dad, I can't thank you enough. This changes everything for us." As they settled in his living room, Sarah brewing coffee in the kitchen she knew as well as her own, James reflected on the contrast between yesterday and today, from being dismissed as irrelevant based on an expired ID to being reminded of his enduring relevance in the lives of those who mattered most. Perhaps that was the ultimate measure of a life well lived, not the credentials you carried or the recognition you received, but the positive difference you made in the lives you touched. By that standard, despite all the classified operations and commendations, this moment, his daughter's happiness, a future secured, might be his greatest achievement of all. The following Tuesday morning, Riverdale First National Bank's conference room had been transformed. The long mahogany table gleamed under recessed lighting, surrounded by comfortable leather chairs instead of the usual utilitarian seating. Fresh flowers adorned the center of the table, and a coffee service had been arranged along the side wall. Robert Davidson had spared no expense for Colonel Harrison's leadership presentation. Tina arrived 15 minutes early, nervously smoothing her blouse as she entered. To her surprise, she wasn't the first one there. Catherine Winters was already seated, reviewing notes with her characteristic thoroughness. Even more surprising was the presence of Jessica Harmon, the bank's regional director, who rarely visited individual branches except for quarterly reviews. "Good morning, Tina," Catherine greeted warmly. "Come sit by me. I've saved you a spot." As Tina settled into the chair, Jessica Harmon nodded in her direction. "Ms. Rodriguez, I've heard good things about your work with Catherine this past week." Tina blinked in surprise. "Thank you, Ms. Harmon. I'm learning a great deal." The conference room gradually filled with other junior staff members, all curious about the special presentation. Davidson entered last, accompanied by Colonel Harrison, who looked much as he had the previous week, understated in his khaki pants and navy blazer, nothing about his appearance suggesting his distinguished military background, except perhaps the straightness of his posture and the quiet confidence in his eyes. "Good morning, everyone," Davidson began once they were settled. "Thank you for adjusting your schedules to be here today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Colonel James Harrison, United States Marine Corps, retired. Colonel Harrison has graciously agreed to share some insights on leadership principles that apply across all organizations, including banking." Davidson turned to James with genuine respect. "Colonel, the floor is yours." James stood, his movements deliberate but fluid despite his bad knee. He surveyed the room calmly, making brief eye contact with each person present. When his gaze met Tina's, she felt a flicker of recognition, not judgment, but acknowledgement. "Thank you, Robert," James began, his voice strong but unassuming. "Before I start, I want to clarify something. I'm not here to lecture you on banking practices. You're the experts in that field. And I'm not here to tell war stories or reminisce about my military career. Instead, I want to share some principles that have served me well across very different contexts. Principles, I believe, are universal." He moved to the front of the room, eschewing the podium Davidson had arranged. "Leadership isn't about rank or position. It's about influence and impact. Each of you, regardless of your title or tenure, has the opportunity to lead every day through your actions and decisions." James glanced down at his notes, then set them aside. "I'd like to begin with a story, not from a battlefield or a classified operation, but from an ordinary Tuesday at a local bank." Tina felt her cheeks warm, knowing immediately what was coming. But rather than the humiliation she expected, James's words took an unexpected turn. "Last week, I came to this bank to conduct what I thought would be a routine transaction. I presented an expired ID, which was properly questioned by your staff. What happened next revealed some important truths about leadership that I'd like to explore with you today." He paced slowly as he spoke, engaging different sections of the room. "First, leadership requires seeing beyond the surface. When you interact with customers, colleagues, or anyone else, you're seeing only the tip of the iceberg, what they choose to present. Beneath the surface lies their full story, their hopes, struggles, accomplishments, and potential." James paused, allowing the words to settle. "The expired ID in my wallet says very little about who I am. The same is true for the single mother rushing to make a deposit during her lunch break, the elderly gentleman who takes longer to count his money, or the teenager opening their first account. Each person contains depths you cannot see from a glance at their appearance or paperwork." Several staff members nodded, including Catherine Winters, who was watching James with evident appreciation for his message. "Second," James continued, "leadership means understanding the difference between procedure and purpose. Procedures exist to serve purposes, not the other way around. When we elevate procedure over purpose, we risk missing opportunities to fulfill our true mission." He turned slightly, addressing the bank executives directly. "In banking, your procedures exist to ensure security, compliance, and efficiency. These are important, But your purpose, your mission, is to help people build financial security, achieve their dreams, and create legacies. When procedure and purpose seem to conflict, great leaders find creative ways to honor both. Jessica Harmon was taking notes now, her expression thoughtful. Third, James said, his voice taking on a more personal tone, leadership requires courage, not just the dramatic courage that makes headlines, but the quiet courage to speak up when something doesn't seem right, even when you're the most junior person in the room. His gaze fell briefly on Tina, not accusingly, but encouragingly. It takes courage to question a procedure that seems to be missing the point. It takes courage to advocate for a customer when doing so might invite criticism. It takes courage to admit when you've made a mistake or failed to act when you should have. Tina felt a lump forming in her throat. She'd expected to be singled out for her failure to intervene last week. Instead, Colonel Harrison was offering her a path forward, acknowledging the courage it would have taken while implicitly suggesting she could demonstrate that courage in the future. Fourth, James continued, great leadership involves recognizing that authority and respect are earned, not conferred by title or position. True authority comes from character, competence, and consistency. He smiled slightly. In the Marines, we say that rank makes you a commander, but only your actions make you a leader. Your customers don't care about your title. They care about whether you treat them with dignity, solve their problems effectively, and demonstrate integrity in your actions. James moved back toward the table, resting his hands lightly on the back of a chair. Finally, leadership means understanding that every interaction is an opportunity to make a positive difference in someone's life, or to inflict unnecessary harm. The room had grown very quiet, everyone focused intently on his words. Banking might seem routine to you because you do it every day, but for your customers, a visit to this bank might represent a pivotal moment in their lives, buying their first home, sending a child to college, starting a business, preparing for retirement. How you handle those moments matters profoundly. James straightened, his military bearing momentarily more evident. In my career, I learned that leadership isn't measured by the medals on your chest or the rank on your collar. It's measured by the impact you have on others, whether you leave them better or worse for having encountered you. He glanced around the room once more. I suspect the same is true in banking. Your success isn't ultimately measured by transactions processed or products sold, but by lives improved through your service. James nodded to Davidson, signaling he was ready for questions. For a moment, the room remained silent, absorbing his words. Then Catherine Winters raised her hand. Colonel Harrison, you mentioned creative ways to honor both procedure and purpose when they seem to conflict. Could you elaborate on that with an example? James nodded appreciatively. Excellent question. In military operations, we often faced situations where standard procedure might compromise the mission objective. Rather than simply abandoning procedure, which ensures safety and consistency, we would step back and ask, what is this procedure trying to protect or achieve? How can we honor that intent while still accomplishing our purpose? He thought for a moment. In banking terms, consider a situation where a regular customer needs access to funds but lacks standard documentation. Procedure says no. Purpose, serving the customer's legitimate needs, says yes. The creative approach asks, what is the procedure protecting against? Fraud, identity theft. How can we verify identity and prevent fraud through alternative means, while still helping this customer? Catherine nodded, satisfied with the response. Other hands raised, and for the next 30 minutes, James fielded questions with thoughtful, practical answers that connected military leadership principles to everyday banking scenarios. His responses were never theoretical platitudes, but grounded in real experience, offering actionable insights the staff could immediately apply. Finally, Davidson stood to signal the session's conclusion. Colonel Harrison, on behalf of everyone at Riverdale First National, thank you for sharing your wisdom and experience with us today. I know I speak for all of us when I say we've gained valuable perspective that will enhance our service to our customers and our community. As the staff applauded and began to disperse, James remained by the conference table, speaking quietly with Davidson and Jessica Harmon. Tina lingered, gathering her notes slowly, working up the courage to approach him. Catherine noticed her hesitation and gave her an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, Tina walked over to where James stood. Colonel Harrison, I wanted to thank you personally for your presentation. It was illuminating. James turned to her with a warm smile. Ms. Rodriguez, isn't it? Yes, sir, Tina replied, surprised he remembered her name. I was present last week when the incident occurred. She swallowed hard. I wanted to apologize for not speaking up when I should have. James studied her for a moment. Recognizing when we've fallen short is the first step toward doing better next time, Ms. Rodriguez. The true test of character isn't avoiding mistakes, it's how we respond to them and what we learn from them. Davidson and Harmon had moved away, giving them privacy for this conversation. Tina felt tears threatening, but blinked them back. I won't make the same mistake again, sir. I believe you, James said simply. You know, in the Marines, we have a saying, today's failure is tomorrow's instructor. Learn from this experience, but don't let it define you. Tina nodded gratefully. Ms. Winters has been helping me understand what true client service means. She's an incredible mentor. You're fortunate, James agreed. Good mentors are invaluable. They don't just teach skills, they shape character. He glanced across the room to where Catherine was gathering her things. Ms. Winters strikes me as someone who understands that banking, like any profession, is ultimately about people, not procedures. Exactly, Tina said, her enthusiasm evident. She knows every client's story, not just their financial information, but what matters to them personally. James nodded approvingly. That's the difference between processing transactions and building relationships. Remember that distinction and you'll go far in this field or any other. As they concluded their conversation, James shook Tina's hand firmly. I look forward to seeing where your career takes you, Ms. Rodriguez. Perhaps our paths will cross again. I hope so, sir, Tina replied, feeling strangely encouraged despite the circumstances of their first meeting. As the day progressed, the impact of James's presentation rippled through the bank. Staff members could be overheard discussing his points during lunch breaks and between customer interactions. Davidson had arranged for the session to be recorded and planned to make. It required viewing for all new employees during orientation. Meanwhile, across town, Melissa Jenkins sat in her small apartment, staring at the unpaid bills spread across her kitchen table. The 2-week suspension without pay was hitting harder than she'd anticipated, especially coming right before rent was due. She'd spent the past week alternating between resentment, embarrassment, and genuine soul-searching about her approach to her job, to people in general. The buzzing of her phone interrupted her calculations. The caller ID showed Robert Davidson. Her heart raced as she answered. Mr. Davidson, hello. Ms. Jenkins. Davidson's voice was professional but not cold. I'm calling to check in. How are you using this time? Melissa hesitated, considering whether to offer platitudes about reflection and growth or admit the truth. Something in her pushed toward honesty. It's been, difficult, sir, financially and emotionally, but also clarifying. I've been thinking a lot about why I responded the way I did to Colonel Harrison. And what have you concluded? Davidson asked, his tone neutral. Melissa sighed. that I've been measuring the wrong things, valuing efficiency over empathy, treating people based on what I thought they could do for me or the bank, not based on basic respect. She paused. I've been reviewing our customer service handbook and realized how far I've drifted from those principles. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Davidson spoke, his voice softer. That's an important realization, Melissa. Self-awareness is the foundation of growth. I'd like to apologize to Colonel Harrison personally, Melissa said suddenly, surprising even herself with the declaration. Not to save my job or repair my reputation, but because he deserves that acknowledgement from me. Davidson seemed to consider this. Colonel Harrison was at the bank today, giving a presentation on leadership to our junior staff. His insights were remarkable, including his thoughts on making amends and learning from mistakes. Melissa felt a pang of regret at missing what sounded like a valuable session. He seems like an extraordinary person. He is, Davidson agreed, which is why I think your idea has merit. Colonel Harrison will be returning next week to consult on our Veterans Financial Services program. If you're sincere about apologizing, I can arrange a brief meeting. I am sincere, Melissa assured him, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. And what about my position? Will I still be transferred to operations? Davidson's tone firmed again. Yes, that decision stands. You need time away from customer-facing roles to rebuild your approach to service. However, I've been considering something. The operations department is implementing a new efficiency initiative. Your attention to detail and process knowledge could be valuable there, potentially in a team lead capacity, once you've demonstrated the changes we've discussed. It wasn't a complete reprieve, but it offered a path forward that acknowledged both her strengths and the areas where she needed growth. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Davidson. I won't disappoint you. See that you don't, Davidson replied, not unkindly. We'll talk next week about your return. In the meantime, I'm emailing you a recording of Colonel Harrison's presentation. I suggest you watch it carefully. After they hung up, Melissa checked her email and found the video waiting. She pressed play, not knowing quite what to expect. Perhaps a stern lecture about respect, or worse, a public recounting of her behavior. Instead, she found herself watching a masterclass in leadership principles delivered with quiet dignity by the very man she had dismissed so cavalierly. There was no mention of her specifically, no recrimination or public shaming, just wisdom offered generously by someone who had every right to harbor resentment but chose to channel his experience into helping others grow. By the end of the video, tears streamed down Melissa's face, not from humiliation, but from the dawning recognition of the person she wanted to become versus the person she had been. The contrast was stark and uncomfortable, but for the first time, she saw a clear path between the two. The following Tuesday, James Harrison returned to Riverdale First National as promised to consult on their Veterans Financial Services program. The meeting with Davidson and the program team had gone well, resulting in several practical improvements to help military personnel transition to civilian financial life, a cause close to James's heart. As the meeting concluded, Davidson pulled James aside. "Colonel, there's someone who's asked to speak with you briefly, if you can spare a few minutes. Melissa Jenkins, the customer service representative from last week." James raised an eyebrow but nodded. Of course. Davidson led him to a small conference room where Melissa waited, visibly nervous, in a conservative navy dress, her usual confident demeanor replaced by genuine humility. She stood immediately when they entered. "Ms. Jenkins, I'll leave you two to talk," Davidson said, closing the door behind him as he exited. An uncomfortable silence filled the room before Melissa spoke. "Colonel Harrison, thank you for agreeing to see me. I wanted to apologize personally for my behavior last week. It was disrespectful, unprofessional, and completely unacceptable. James studied her for a moment, noting the sincerity in her eyes. "Apology accepted, Miss Jenkins." Melissa seemed surprised by the simple response. "Just like that?" "Holding grudges serves no constructive purpose," James replied matter-of-factly. "You've acknowledged your mistake. What matters now is what you learn from it." Melissa nodded, relief evident in her posture. "I watched your presentation on leadership. It made me think about how I've been approaching my job, my interactions, with people in general. I've been measuring success by all the wrong metrics." James gestured for her to sit, taking a chair across from her. "What metrics have you been using?" "Efficiency, processing speed, authority." Melissa looked down at her hands. "I thought being good at my job meant being fast and firm, showing everyone I was in charge. And now," James prompted gently, "now I see that none of that matters if people leave feeling diminished by their interaction with me." She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "You talked about leaving people better for having encountered you. I've been doing the opposite." James nodded thoughtfully. "Recognition is the first step toward transformation, Miss Jenkins. The question is, what will you do with this insight?" "Start over," she said simply. "I'm being reassigned to operations, away from customer contact for now. It's the right decision. I need to rebuild my approach from the ground up." "We all need recalibration sometimes," James said. "In the Marines, we called it heading check, making sure we were still moving in the right direction toward our objective." Melissa smiled faintly. "That's a good way to think about it." As their conversation concluded, James offered one final thought. "Ms. Jenkins, in my experience, the most effective leaders are often those who have faced significant failures and learned from them. Your current situation isn't an ending, it's an opportunity for a new beginning, if you choose to see it that way." Melissa extended her hand, which James shook firmly. "Thank you, Colonel Harrison, not just for accepting my apology, but for showing me what real leadership looks like." 6 months later, Riverdale First National Bank held its annual employee recognition dinner. Among the awardees was Tina Rodriguez, recognized for exceptional client service and promoted to Senior Client Relationship Specialist, working directly alongside Catherine Winters. Also recognized was Melissa Jenkins, who had transformed the Operations Department's efficiency initiative into a resounding success, while simultaneously developing a training program that balanced procedural compliance with client-centered service. Her presentation on efficiency with empathy had been adopted by all branches in the regional network. In the audience sat James Harrison, invited as a special guest by Robert Davidson. Since his initial consultation, James had become a regular advisor to the bank's Veteran Services Program, helping design financial education specifically for military personnel transitioning to civilian life. As he watched Tina and Melissa receive their awards, two young women whose careers had been profoundly shaped by a single interaction involving an expired military ID, James reflected on the ripple effects of seemingly small moments. How one incident had created opportunities for growth, mentorship, and positive change throughout the organization. The evening's keynote speaker was Jessica Harmon, recently promoted to National Director of Retail Banking Operations. Her topic, the currency of respect, building a client-centered banking culture. "In financial services, we deal with currency every day," she began, "but the most valuable currency we exchange isn't measured in dollars and cents. It's measured in respect, dignity, and human connection." As she continued, James recognized several principles from his own presentation months earlier, now woven into the bank's official philosophy. His quiet influence had extended far beyond that one difficult interaction at the customer service desk. After the ceremony, Davidson approached James with a glass of sparkling water. Your expired ID turned out to be quite the catalyst for positive change around here, Colonel. James smiled. Sometimes our greatest impacts come not from our grand achievements, but from how we handle everyday moments. Davidson nodded thoughtfully. You know, we've created a new position, Director of Leadership Development. The role would involve mentoring our management team, consulting on client service principles, and helping shape our organizational culture. He looked at James meaningfully. We could use someone with your perspective. James considered the offer, surprised to find himself genuinely interested. After decades of service in the shadows, the opportunity to openly shape future leaders held unexpected appeal. Perhaps this was the next chapter in his ongoing mission. Different battlefield, same essential purpose, helping others reach their full potential while maintaining their moral compass. I'd like to hear more about that, James replied, extending his hand to seal the beginning of a new partnership. As they shook hands, James reflected that his expired military ID, the small piece of plastic that had triggered this entire chain of events, had ultimately opened more doors than it had closed. Sometimes, he mused, our greatest strengths lie not in the credentials we carry, but in the character we demonstrate when those credentials are questioned. 1 year later, the Riverdale First National Bank looked markedly different. The physical space remained largely unchanged. The same marble floors and mahogany counters still greeted customers, but the atmosphere had transformed completely. Employees moved with purpose, but without rushing, greeting clients by name, taking time to listen fully before responding. The mechanical efficiency that had once characterized the branch had been replaced by something more human, more connected, without sacrificing professionalism. In his spacious corner office, James Harrison reviewed the quarterly leadership development reports with quiet satisfaction. The position Davidson had offered him, Director of Leadership Development, had evolved into something far more significant than either of them had initially envisioned. What began as a consulting role had expanded into a comprehensive transformation of the bank's culture, with effects that reached far beyond Riverdale to all 50 branches in the regional network. A soft knock at his door interrupted his review. Tina Rodriguez entered, carrying a leather portfolio and exuding the quiet confidence she had developed over the past year. At 28, she had become the youngest senior client relationship manager in the bank's history, her natural empathy complemented by exceptional financial acumen. The community outreach numbers are in, Colonel, she said, using the title she had never abandoned despite James's repeated invitations to call him by his first name. Some habits, shaped by respect, proved resistant to change. We've exceeded the quarterly goals by 32%. James smiled. Excellent work, Tina, the Veterans Financial Literacy Program in particular. James considered the question seriously. Different than I expected. When Zara was born, I felt a fierce need to protect her, to make the world safer for her, with Elizabeth. He paused, searching for the right words. I feel the same protective instinct, but also something else. A sense of continuation, legacy. That's how it should be, Mike replied, his voice softening. We did our part to make the world safer. Now we watch the next generations build something in that space we helped create. After ending the call, James sat in contemplative silence, Mike's words resonating deeply. Legacy. It was a concept he'd never paid much attention to during his active service years, too focused on the immediate mission to consider the longer arc of influence. Now, with 30 years of military service behind him and an unexpected second career well underway, he found himself thinking more about the mark he would leave, not in medals or commendations, but in lives influenced and values transmitted. The hospital room door opened quietly, and a young nurse entered. different from those who'd been attending Sarah earlier. She carried a clipboard and approached James with a professional smile. "Colonel Harrison, I need to update some information for our records regarding the Campbell baby. Hospital policy requires verification of all family visitors, especially during overnight hours." She held out her hand. "May I see your ID, please?" James reached for his wallet automatically, then paused. Since the incident at the bank over, a year ago, he had made a point of renewing his military identification card, which now rested beside his driver's license. But something in the nurse's manner, a certain stiffness perhaps, or the lateness of the hour for routine paperwork, triggered the situational awareness that had kept him alive through decades of service. "Of course," he replied smoothly. "But first, could you remind me of the attending physician's name, just to verify you have the right Campbell family?" The nurse hesitated almost imperceptibly. "Dr. Johnson, of course." James maintained his pleasant expression while mentally noting that Sarah's doctor was Dr. Patel, a fact this nurse should have known. "I see. And which nursery is Elizabeth in currently, the East or West Wing?" Another slight hesitation. "The East Wing nursery, standard procedure for all newborns." James knew Riverdale Memorial had only one nursery. He reached for his phone instead of his wallet. "Before I provide my ID, I'd like to call hospital security to verify this late-night procedure. Standard practice, I'm sure you understand." The nurse stiffened, then abruptly turned toward the door. James was faster, despite his bad knee. He positioned himself between the imposter and the exit, his voice dropping to the quiet, authoritative tone that had commanded respect in far more dangerous situations. "I suggest you sit down and explain exactly who you are and what you're doing in my daughter's hospital room at midnight, asking for identification." The woman's demeanor changed instantly, her professional facade crumbling. I'm sorry. I'm just doing my job. The magazine pays well for birth announcements of prominent families, and with Dr. Campbell being chief of pediatrics and you being..." She trailed off, apparently recognizing her serious error in judgment. "A private citizen whose family deserves privacy," James finished for her. He picked up the room phone. "I'm calling security now. I suggest you cooperate fully when they arrive." Within minutes, 2 hospital security officers had escorted the woman, a freelance photographer for a celebrity gossip magazine, as it turned out, from the premises. The hospital administrator on call arrived shortly thereafter, profusely apologetic about the breach. "Colonel Harrison, I cannot express how deeply sorry we are about this incident. We're implementing immediate measures to prevent any recurrence." James, now standing protective watch near Sarah and Mark, who remained asleep through the commotion, nodded gravely. "I appreciate that. My primary concern is my daughter and granddaughter's safety and privacy." "Absolutely," the administrator agreed. "We've already stationed an officer outside this room for the remainder of your family's stay, and we're reviewing all visitor logs and security footage." After the administrator left, James resumed his vigil in the chair beside Sarah's bed. The incident had shaken him more than he cared to admit, not for his own sake, but for his family's. In his previous career, he had maintained careful separation between his professional activities and his personal life, precisely to prevent his work from endangering his loved ones. Now, ironically, his more public role at the bank had created visibility he hadn't anticipated. Sarah stirred, her eyes opening slowly. "Dad? Is everything okay? I thought I heard voices." "Everything's fine, sweetheart," James assured her, taking her hand. "Just a minor security issue that's been handled." Sarah studied his face with the perceptiveness she'd inherited from her mother. "Your situation-contained expression. Remember that from when I was little." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you for being here, for always protecting us. Always will, James replied simply. As Sarah drifted back to sleep, James reflected on the night's events. The attempted intrusion, while relatively minor, had illuminated something important, that his protective instincts remained as sharp as ever, but his sphere of concern had expanded, from national security to family security to now, in his role at the bank, financial security for an entire community. The common thread was service, using his skills and experience to protect what mattered, whether classified intelligence or a newborn grandchild or the financial well-being of military families transitioning to civilian life. The uniform and context had changed, but the core mission remained the same. 2 days later, James stood in the doorway of the nursery in Sarah and Mark's home, watching as his daughter gently placed Elizabeth in her crib. The room was painted a soft green, with images of woodland creatures adorning the walls, foxes, owls, rabbits, all watching over the newest Campbell with painted eyes that somehow managed to look both whimsical and wise. "She's finally asleep," Sarah whispered, joining her father in the doorway. "I'd forgotten how exhausting these first days are. Your mother used to say that having a newborn was like running a marathon while solving complex equations and negotiating international treaties, all on no sleep," James recalled with a smile. They moved to the living room, where Mark was unpacking a care package sent by his parents from Seattle. Sarah curled up on the sofa, pulling a blanket over her legs despite the mild spring temperature, another trait inherited from Elizabeth, Sr., who had always felt cold after giving birth. "Dad, there's something Mark and I wanted to talk to you about," Sarah began, exchanging a meaningful glance with her husband. Mark set aside the package and joined them, sitting beside Sarah. "We've been thinking about this for a while, even before Elizabeth was born." James raised an eyebrow, waiting for them to continue. "You know, I've been offered the position of Chief of Pediatric Surgery at Boston Children's Hospital," Marky said. "It's an incredible opportunity professionally. And my research grant has been expanded," Sarah added. She was a developmental psychologist specializing in childhood trauma recovery. "The new funding would allow me to scale the program nationally, but it would mean more travel, more administrative responsibilities." James nodded, already seeing where the conversation was heading. "Boston is a long way from Riverdale." "It is," Mark acknowledged, "but we've been thinking, what if you came with us?" The question hung in the air, unexpected despite the obvious lead-up. James looked between them, processing the invitation. "You've created something remarkable at the bank," Sarah continued. "The leadership program, the Veterans Initiative. They're established now, with strong teams running them. And Boston has dozens of financial institutions that would benefit from your expertise. Or you could take a well-deserved retirement," Mark suggested. "Focus on being grandpa full-time. Elizabeth will need someone to teach her tactical maneuvers in the playground." James smiled at the image, but remained thoughtful. "I appreciate the offer, more than you know. But Boston is where Mom always wanted to visit," Sarah finished softly. "Remember how she talked about walking the Freedom Trail, seeing the historical sites? You two never made it there together." The reference to Elizabeth's unfulfilled wish touched something deep in James. His late wife had maintained a list of places they planned to visit once he retired, a list they never completed due to her illness. "Take some time to think about it," Mark urged. "We don't need an answer today. We're not moving for at least 3 months." As James drove home that evening, his mind turned over the unexpected proposition. Boston, a new beginning in a historic city, proximity to his granddaughter as she grew, the opportunity to honor Elizabeth's wish to explore New England, even if she couldn't be there physically, but also leaving Riverdale, the community where he had found purpose after retirement, the bank where a simple incident with an expired ID had led to an unexpected second career, the veterans he worked with regularly, many of whom had come to rely on his guidance. Approaching his house, James noticed a car parked outside. Robert Davidson's silver Audi. The bank director was waiting on the porch, a folder in his hands and a serious expression on his face. "Robert," James greeted him as he approached. "This is unexpected." Davidson stood, extending his hand. "Sorry to drop by unannounced. I tried calling, but it went to voicemail. I have news that couldn't wait about the merger." Inside, James prepared coffee, while Davidson spread documents across the kitchen table. The proposed merger with First Capital had been finalized that morning, with terms that exceeded expectations. "The board was impressed by our community-focused model," Davidson explained, "particularly the Veterans Program and Leadership Development Initiative, so impressed, in fact, that they want to implement similar programs across all their branches nationally." James set 2 mugs on the table and sat across from Davidson. "That's excellent news for the approach we've developed. But I sense there's more to this visit." Davidson nodded, pushing a particular document forward. "They want you, James, as National Director of Leadership and Community Development. It would mean overseeing the expansion of your programs to over 200 branches across the country." James picked up the document, scanning the terms of the proposed position. The compensation was generous, the responsibilities substantial, the potential impact far-reaching. "There's one more thing," Davidson added. "The position would be based in Boston at their New England headquarters. They're particularly interested in expanding the veterans program there, given the military presence in the region." James looked up sharply. "Boston?" Davidson smiled. "I may have mentioned that your daughter and her family were relocating there. The timing seemed providential." That night, after Davidson left, James sat in his study, surrounded by photographs and memories. Elizabeth in her garden, Sarah graduating medical school, his Marine Corps unit in locations that officially never existed, the bank team at last. Year's Community Service Day, his newborn granddaughter grasping his finger with surprising strength. On his desk lay 2 offers, one from his family to join them in Boston for a well-deserved retirement focused on grandfatherhood, the other from First Capital to expand his professional legacy to a national scale, coincidentally in the same city. James picked up the framed photo of Elizabeth that always sat on his desk. "What would you advise, my love?" he asked softly. Though no audible answer came, he felt a sense of clarity emerging. The path forward wasn't about choosing between family and service. It was about integrating them, about bringing together all the elements that had defined his life's purpose into a new chapter that honored them all. He reached for his phone and dialed Sarah's number. When she answered, sounding exhausted but happy, he said simply, "I've been thinking about Boston." "And?" she prompted. "I think Elizabeth would have loved it," James replied, "and I think I will too." The journey that had begun with an expired ID and a moment of disrespect had come full circle, opening unexpected doors to new possibilities, new connections, new forms of service. The identification card that had once defined his past service would now, in its renewed form, accompany him into a future where the definition of service continued to evolve, where the mission remained the same, even as the battlefield changed. James Harrison, retired Marine Corps colonel, future National Director of Leadership and Community Development, and most importantly, devoted father and grandfather, closed his eyes and envisioned Boston's historic streets, imagining walking them with Elizabeth Grace in a stroller, teaching her about courage, respect, and the quiet dignity of serving others, the most valuable legacy he could possibly leave. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.